I think we're ready to begin. According to that clock, it's 2:06, although I don't really believe that, but it's at least 2 o'clock. As we know, the TV and audio is so good that this lecture can be heard everywhere at NLM, so the audience is bigger than this auditorium can hold. We're particularly delighted that Dr. Burkle is going to address us on the topic of, including disasters, and I hope disaster information management. He took the time to meet on Monday on that very topic, and we all were very interested in hearing from him. I should say, in the way of a traditional introduction, that he's a graduate of St. Michael's College and then the University of Vermont College of Medicine. But of course, his CV is so incredibly extensive that I could waste all of his time reciting his degrees and appointments and his accomplishments. But they do include a book on disaster medicine. And he's given a great deal of thought to the relationship of essentially the political people to the doctors, the scientists, and to the needs of the world. So I'm sure that we'll have a very good talk from him. He has achieved a kind of a epitome of curriculum vitae-ness in that he can honestly claim to a Harvard degree and a Yale education. That's pretty good. He also arranged something that I had greatly benefited from, namely he has multiple offices. So it must be really enormously difficult to try to find you. I mean, I can imagine somebody showing up in Hawaii and saying, well, you know, I would like to see the professor of surgery and adjunct professor of tropical medicine, Professor Burkle, only to be told, gee, you really got to go to Harvard. Back to Boston, where he's in the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, the School of Public Health. And I could picture somebody saying, oh, well, I actually already went there, but they told me you got to go to Washington, D.C., where he's in the Center for International Scholars. So I think you've really worked your life and your CV and your PR extraordinarily skillfully, and I very much look forward to hearing from you on the topic of disaster medicine.
Can you hear me okay? Good. Well, thank you, Dr. Lindberg, for that kind introduction. And I'd like to thank the NLM and certainly in the Medical Librarians Association, but specifically the Disaster Information Management Research Center for this honor and opportunity to speak to you. Now, I'm going to start off quite honestly with an apology, because my talk, I hope you will walk away with some information that you did not have before. It's not that uplifting, I have to tell you, in terms of topics, but it is all quite accurate, true as can be, and I think updated. So we'll see what happens. I'm going to try, and well, there'll be times when I will really talk about either the potential for more information management, especially at the community level, because we're moving more to community level in terms of worldwide, in terms of handling major crises. But also you need to understand that the communities need information in order to do what they need to do, and we haven't really cracked that code just yet. So I have a number of things, but they're really all coming together, but I'm talking more about major crises as we go along. Now the theme really is increasingly all domestic disasters are under the influence of a sort of integrated global changes and forces. People really haven't thought that way for a long time. El Nino, which started in the southern part of the South Pacific, certainly had an effect on the frequency of tornadoes and the amount of rain and water and flooding that we've had in the South and in the central part of the United States. So there's an integration. We certainly now, with the warming of the oceans, have seen bacteria, unfortunately, in the Vibrio genus, which contains cholera, moving north. So cholera, quite honestly, has been seen for the first time in Scandinavian countries. But also, for those of you who remember when Chernobyl happened, oh yes, people were concerned about the fallout, you know, and getting into the cow's milk in Finland and also Alaska and things like that. But quite honestly, the whole nuclear plant issues, there wasn't much consideration with individual countries at that time. As a matter of fact, it was sort of just brushed off that the Russians didn't know what they were doing. They just messed things up, and their plants were not really very good in Chernobyl. You need to know that the same model that was in Chernobyl is the only model that exists and still exists in Russia today. All right? It had nothing to do with that at all. But look what happened with Fukushima. All right? Almost immediately, countries began to reassess, you know, the nuclear threats. Unfortunately, we do not have, and that's one of the problems, any strategic plan for nuclear threats of any sort globally. I'll speak a little bit about that later. But just because of Fukushima, well, they've shut down, they had 55 plants. They shut them all down except for one, and that was closed 2 days ago. And you can read about it actually in the latest issue of Nature, where they reassessed just how high with a earthquake the tsunami will be. So all the East Coast ones, woo, they said we've got it. It's much higher than we ever thought. But Germany, Italy, Switzerland, Sweden, Belgium have all closed down or are closing down all their nuclear plants. So it's really made quite an impact, and we'll see. They're going to rely on, granted, some part of our what we're paying in the gas prices at the pump is because Japan is buying more, but the whole energy issues because of this is going to be quite a daunting issue in the future. Now, of everything that I talk about, there is a common thread that you need to know. So just think about that as we jump from one to the other, because all of these major crises produce what we call major public health emergencies. So they affect water and sanitation and shelter and food and energy and all the rest of the stuff. But this also comes at a very inconvenient time because the entire world, public health infrastructure and the social protections that public health provide to citizens is in tremendous decline. They haven't been maintained. A lot has been lost or destroyed during war that you'll see. And it's even in the United States. I mean, we're just waiting to improve the infrastructure. But just in the Washington area, I mean, you can go, you know, this was marshland that was essentially given to develop the capital here, but real floodplains, but the pipings with the aquifers that were put in the 1800s still remain. All right? So there's simple things like that affect pretty much every state in the Union. The important thing, too, is, you know, we focus in on the event and the direct causes, deaths, injuries, but in these situations that we're going to talk about really produce more indirect effects over a period of time. So over a period of time, we actually have more deaths and more illness and what have you from the indirect effects, and they outstrip those numbers with the direct effects. The solutions you need to know are really not up to any individual nation states. They are global, will be global, and increasingly community-based, which I'll talk about, and that has a lot of strong implications for MLA's future, and we talked a little bit about that the other day. I did attend. I was one of really the only health person 2 weeks ago at the Council on Foreign Relations, which were 25 people looking at crises from now till 2020. What I was struck with was the fact that, and so these were all government agencies, intelligence agency, but their attempt was, okay, how does the United States control this? Okay, and I listened to this for a while, and I just had to interrupt, and I said, you know, the U.S., if you're going to think about doing this as one nation, that's not the way. These are global initiatives, and you're going to have to get used to working with people and agencies that you haven't done in the past. Let's first look at conflict, because that has preoccupied us, haven't they, for the last, certainly the last 3 decades. It's just a study. It is in press. It's going to be published. But you can see here that we're looking at populations exposed to war and violence, and pretty much they mirrored each other. The numbers of people who died and the numbers of populations in millions who were exposed to conflict. And then we began to see a split. And as a matter of fact, now we have the lowest number ever, it includes all of the 20th century too, of declared wars. It's never been so low. But we have the highest number, and it's actually much higher now, almost 400 million, of populations exposed to conflict. All right? Now, we've had declarations of peace and agreements and things like that, but that's great for the diplomats, and I was a diplomat for a period of time, but that's not necessarily make the population happy. So increasingly we have more and more people who are still living in conflict, even though the war, quote unquote, has been over. So this is different. Again, the direct and indirect deaths, and you need to know that here the blue line is the direct deaths, like shock and awe and what you hear about from violence, what you hear in the press, very sexy, like that's all that's happening. But usually, and the reason why in public health we study conflict is that it's important for us. We see right up front what happens when the public health system is destroyed and how long it takes for the emergence of diseases and things like that. I was the first American actually to go into Baghdad after the 2003 war, because I was the interim minister of health, but I was also the first American to go into Baghdad along with 2 Swiss and a Libyan to negotiate for the Kurds. Saddam was thought to be dead at the time, and we were trying to get the Kurds back into their homes because they had fled way up in the mountains, if you remember. But the interesting thing is that Baghdad at the time had not had a case of cholera in over 20 years. The electrical grids that runs everything, water, sanitation, et cetera, were destroyed in the war. And when you remove that infrastructure, that vital infrastructure, take the lid off it, within 10 days they started to have cases of cholera in Baghdad alone. All right? So it's always there. But our public health systems is really to put a lid on these things. So that begins to start going up. I hope you can see this. And as a matter of fact, 70 to 90% in a period of time of deaths and illnesses are actually preventable deaths that are not related to violence. But we don't hear about it. This is what we hear in the news. So when the shooting stops, that continues to go. All right? And that does not come back to the baseline for over a decade. All right? Who are these people? They're usually women, children. There's a lot of psychosocial and depression issues and things like that. But that's what we see. But when the shooting stops, of course, the donors leave, the NGOs leave, and we have much more of an exposed population than ever. This is part of that original study, but we looked at these post-conflict, post-war places after 5 years and also after 10 years. And this goes back to World War II, so the light area is where there's practically no conflict remaining. But after World War II, all the weapons were removed. People were eager to get back, build factories, get back to a normal life. But as we've come along in modern times, and the darker the level here, the more the intensity is of the violence. So what we're seeing now is after 10 years, still a population, and we use 10 different qualitative and quantitative indices, but we also ask the population, do you feel like you're secure? All right. So obviously a lot of them do not. This also explains why the Marshall Plan, which we were all, those of us who were interim ministers and everything, had to read, and that was the plan, that the Marshall Plan was going to be reborn. But it was impossible to do in Iraq and impossible to do it in Afghanistan. And I think a lot of us knew this right from the beginning. But Can you read that all right? Yeah, okay. But the difference between populations at war and post-conflict really getting blurred by this level of low intensity conflict. The resource base, and when I say resource base, we're talking about public health infrastructure that you take normal when you go home, you turn the faucet on, flush the toilet, things like that, is 10% of what it was before the war. And there's really no one there now, oh yeah, we'll fix it. Okay? Weaponry and intimidation, especially in Africa, remains. The ecosystem is unrestored. Believe it or not, we now have warfare ecologists who actually go in after warfare to try to bring the ecosystem back. All right. We'll talk more about that. Infectious diseases are rampant, but not monitored because nobody's there to do the surveillance anymore. And that explains why 47% of the countries return to conflict within 10 years. And if we're talking about African countries, it's up to 60%. So this is really the epitome of what we call public health emergency. Also, you know, conventional warfare is when it's cross borders. The war is over some territory or resources, you know, things like that. But we have the lowest number of declared wars, I said. But what we're witnessing is what we call unconventional warfare. So we look at, yes, we'll look at Iraq and Afghanistan and other places. But the interesting thing is that primarily the military has focused in on the unconventional warfare themselves and their dealings with whether it's terrorists, insurgents, or whatever. But there are really three components in this Venn diagram. First off, if we take Iraq, it was not until about 2007 that people began to really worry about how pervasive this insecurity was and how many civilians were dying. Right? Also, and this is a paper that I wrote for The Lancet, that all of them produce, all these unconventional warfare issues produce catastrophic public health emergencies. So Iraq, quite honestly, had fairly good infant mortality rates, maternal mortality rates, underage 5 mortality rates. These are the kinds of things that we measure and that come out in WHO and things like that. They were probably the best in the Middle East. Within a very short period of time, they were actually, the infant mortality rate was among the 4 worst in the world, along with Afghanistan, Sierra Leone, and Liberia. So war does that. All right? The interesting thing also is that I mentioned 2007 because it just deteriorated, and it's still quite bad. And a lot of the infrastructure still is not repaired. But when they had the surge, which McCain said, you know, my idea and everything, you need to know that the NGOs right from the beginning said, this is what you have to do. You have to go to the communities and you have to protect them, okay? But quite honestly, the plan was first to leave Iraq in 3 months, but then when I went up, the first one to go up, and then when we pulled the other interministers up, Rumsfeld said we'll be out in 3 weeks. Surprise, okay? So they were not planned for this, but it took them that long, and it was actually, you know, advised by other people, not by the politicians. A lot of evolving changes. You know, Petraeus said about a year ago, maybe a little bit more, that occupying a country and doing nation building as an answer to counterterrorism just doesn't work. Okay. At the same time, when he said this, he said, you know what, we need to know more about the culture of Afghanistan. You know, I was in the Vietnam War in '68. We didn't understand the culture of Vietnam. We don't understand the culture. Didn't understand the culture of Iraq. You can't do these things unless you understand the culture. Okay. Certainly, widespread dissatisfaction has arisen from the donors with the role of both politics and the military in aid. The unfortunate thing is, you know, my generation took a lot of time and attention to be sure that we were neutral, we were impartial, we were independent, whether it's WHO, whether it's the International Committee of Red Cross, whatever. But health has been absorbed and certainly pulled in by the military. So we were what was called certainly a soft power, but all of a sudden we were pulled in as a hard power. Everybody was doing health, including the military. If the military comes from the U.S. or coalitions and we have speak the same language, and the same color skin, then we belong to them. You need to know that. So we lost, unfortunately, our autonomy and independence as an effective soft power. Health has. So we must move, and the donors, DFID, the Department for Foreign of International Development, comparable to USAID, but in London, has said, look, we're not going to do any more of this short-term feel-good winning hearts and minds, but return to long-term root cause issues. Okay, yeah, they're supporting the security things, but you need to also understand that all of the aid projects, this is pretty much in most of the Middle East and Africa, every year we have doubled the number of programs, projects that have collapsed or are suspended because the security problems are so bad or there's danger to the staff. Okay. The 270 in 2010, 270 aid workers suffered from deliberate violence to them, and 90 were kidnapped. You don't necessarily hear about that, but more than peacekeepers. Okay, it's the fifth occupation, most deadly occupation, after loggers and deep sea fishermen and pilots and things like that. But among occupations, we're the highest of those who were then killed by deliberate violence. All right. But what it's come to is that countries now, they want the resources, but they say, right, we don't want you. And the way they think, it might be seen somewhat simplistic, but what they've seen and learned from patterns is that we come in with some aid, but that leads to then, in a short period of time, the military coming in and more violence. And so they put it that way, so don't come in. You know, all the NGOs except for the Islamic ones were removed from Somalia. And I'm on the board of directors of International Rescue Committee, which is the largest NGO for refugees. But about over 50% of the projects are actually managed remotely from outside the country, right? Because it's so dangerous. The journalists have gotten in on this too, and this is actually from a piece in the Lancet. But you know, journalists would probably normally just take a picture of this girl in her confirmation dress, you know, leaving for it, which is what we usually have. And they said, look, you know, people don't really understand what's going out there. They've opened their lens. And so it's not just seeing this girl, which is sort of a contradiction, isn't it? So white and pure, the dress, but look at where she comes from, okay? There are other things here too, you know, some of the things we always learn when we're humanitarians, and you get into a village or a refugee camp, if you see the animals are tied to the tent or whatever, then you know the people have enough food for themselves and the animals. But if they're let go, then they have to take care of themselves, right? So same thing here, but this is the way it looks. And so they've realized that they have to have an obligation to educate, get the real information, the true information out of there. I'm going to talk about rapid unsustainable urbanization. You need to know that urbanization is wonderful. It provides about 92% of the economies of most countries. It only exists when the public health infrastructure can meet the demands of the population in water, sanitation, shelter, and what have you. But to have good urbanization, you have to bring supplies like food. Sometimes the water certainly tapped in. But that's what happens in most of the cities that you know about, and certainly the ones that you live here. But rapid unsustainable urbanization is when the population exceeds the ability of the public health infrastructure and social protections to protect that population. And that is happening rather rapidly. And you need to just go back here, but in the early days, we just counted refugees, and we had about 53 million. We didn't really think about the people who were internally displaced. As a matter of fact, under international law, when you're a refugee, the UN High Commissioner for Refugee has the responsibility. But it's the host nation. Even though the host nation is trying to kill you, host nation is the one that has the responsibility for internally displaced. But after 9/11, less people have been refugees to certainly Europe and to North America. But also with the, and I want to tell you, remember when I said all those people that were then remained in those levels of violence exposure? What do they do with themselves? Well, they move. They may go to the cities. They may go to someplace regionally. So the settlements around Nairobi, which are massive, we're not sure exactly how many people are there, but it's over 470,000. But they come from 8 different countries surrounding that particular area. So you'll see that the middle end has increased. So we're dealing with the lowest level, really, of refugees, and this is pretty, it's been there for a long time. But now we're dealing with internally displaced populations. And this is a new challenge for us all. So quite honestly, we feel that the major 21st century crisis is rapid, unsustainable urbanization. But where do these people come from? As I already said, post-conflict populations, from Sudan, but a lot of places in Africa because public health resources are not there. So they come to the cities. Climate change and biodiversity, very, very common crisis, and we'll talk about those in detail. Escaping the conflict population. So quite honestly, Afghanistan is 98% agricultural, rural, but it is slowly becoming an urbanized country. So just in Kabul, there's 320,000 internally displaced that were in the rural areas, but now in the city. They have no political voice. They're constantly being moved around. They have no water, sanitation, and really no good demographics about just how bad the situation is. How many people are dying? What are they dying of? And things like that. And certainly the rural economies have failed, and human security is terrible. You go to Lagos, who's the typical person who ends up there? It's a single or widowed female with 3 to 5 children looking for some kind of security. Usually have a history of being raped and then ends up hoping that they may get a job. But many of them, as you well know, turn to prostitution just to get enough money on the table, food on the table for their kids. So it's a bad situation. This is Mumbai, so you can see the advanced dramatic here, and then surrounding Mumbai is one of the largest populations of internally displaced. And this is some of the contradictions that we see. So if indeed in the United States, North America, and the developed world, only 6% of the people are squatters, what we call the homeless. But in these countries, 78% of the population are squatters or homeless. 67% of the people going into Mumbai are migrants, but there are up to about 350 new families every single day that move in. These people are lost, essentially, to any kind of data collection in terms of what they do and how we need to protect them. In Africa, people escaping to the cities have escaped with all the weapons that have been in 3 decades of war. So that's where the weapon trade centers are. It's big, big business. The police are corrupt. They're predatory gangs. It's terribly violent and a horrible situation. In Asia, they've had an economic base, but the people have come in, but they've moved to disaster-prone areas in the coastal thing. But violence is not necessarily a problem in the Asian situation. So they're different, but they're all becoming mega cities, as you know. The other thing is to recognize that normal urban population growth goes up here, but those that are entering that are in extreme poverty, so let's say making $2 a day, they may go to the cities and make $4 a day for their family of 4, but they don't get out of extreme poverty. And that's actually what happened during the Industrial Revolution, when many people went into the cities in the 1850s. They never really did get out of poverty. So we have, even though Nobody's out there doing good demographics like we did in refugee camps and all the rest of the stuff. But we do know that the highest worldwide underage 5 mortality rates, infant mortality rates, maternal mortality rates are coming from these unsustainable urban centers. You know, if I had given you a test and asked, you know, where do you think most of the people, children are dying, and one was, you know, check off rural Africa, you probably said, oh yeah, that's it. Well, not anymore. Rural Africa has moved to urbanized centers. Right? So we have at least 1 billion people without a political voice. You know, how many of you have ever heard of the sphere standards? These are standards that we have to keep to set up refugee camps. You know, 1 latrine for every 20 people have to be within 50 meters of where they are. So many spaces between people and shelters and whatever. Well, they don't even count. They've been so exceeded. So just as one example, the latrines is 1 for every 200 to 300 people. But they may have to walk up to a mile and pay a fee. They pay a fee in Kabul to do it because somebody owns that. All right? Women do not go to the toilet at night. All of them have rape epidemics that usually occur because of that. Okay? So the sphere standards are absolutely useless. The other thing is we have no real international humanitarian presence from the usual NGOs. What they see is this is just totally, so daunting. Where do you start? You know, with Haiti and then the Pakistan flooding occurring during that time, we expended all the tents available to the humanitarian community. So how are you going to start doing something like this, okay? You think about it, but there's just not that much infrastructure that these NGOs have. Sanitation is ignored. Infectious diseases are rampant. But, you know, we have large populations. We have cities of 30 million. But it's really density is more critical than population numbers. Now, density, we start counting cities' density about 2,000 people per square kilometer. Mumbai, that I showed you, averages 30,000 people per square kilometer. In some areas of Mumbai, there's 1 million people per square kilometer. So if you have an infectious disease, believe me, you spread it around to everybody within milliseconds. Okay, so this is undone. We never had anything quite like this. All right. So if we look at the countries that have the top 400 urban population, we have some in North America, don't we? We have them in the Caribbean, but you can certainly see that in Southeast Asia and near the Tibetan Plateau that we have a lot. That's important, but some of these cities are really doing well. But you have to go to the density. So you can see here in Southeast Asia, especially there, that's where the density problem, and that's where we have the problems that we're talking about. So its density is much more important than population per se. We have, I cut my teeth on humanitarian work in China. I've actually started going there 45 years ago. And when I went there, I was treating malnutrition and poverty. 83% of the population were suffering from malnutrition. So I taught them how to treat their people. I treated people. I love the old China, love the Chinese. I don't like modern China, and we'll talk about that. But there was probably about 40 major cities at the time. Beijing, you would see an occasional car. But as the population has burgeoned, they've gone ahead and built new cities seeking public health infrastructure, just like water, okay, or places to handle the sanitation. So they now have over 600 cities. And when I was there maybe about 6 or 7 years ago, I spoke in Shanghai, and then they wanted to drive me on their new highways to this other major city to give us, but they actually got lost, and they turned off the road, and all of a sudden there was a guard, and guy saw the officials, so they opened up and went in, and in front of us all, and they got nervous as can be because they had an American in the car, but there was massive, massive city, totally white, not a single person around. It was like a neutron bomb hit. You know, neutron bombs don't destroy buildings, but they kill all the people. Okay. Stores, schools, housing, everything, okay, but nobody around, okay? We finally got out, and nobody said anything. Later that night, I said, okay, over dinner, I said, what did we see? because they were not supposed to have. But that was the city of Tong, and about 3 months later, 5 million people were moved there. Okay, so they follow the water, which, as you know, is and the ability to have food, which is unsustainable in China. But here, what they've decided to do is build the first or the largest mega city, not to be on the records, okay, but all of these in the Pearl Delta areas, so north of Hong Kong, if you remember that. And so they've taken all of these cities, all very, very large, and they will pull them together as one major city, the largest one. So 42 million combines the cities, total size of Vermont and New Jersey combined. But the reason being is that all these different cities have their own public health infrastructure and transportation. If they make it one big city, they can control it better, right? Because they can't form new cities anymore. Understand? This is the process that they've been doing. This is the reason why they also need to and will. This is why they wanted to. They're building a dam in Myanmar, but they're planning to go there. They may invade Thailand and Vietnam. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But this is the way the Pearl River Delta looks, but usually skyscrapers, but this is as clean as the air gets. It's pretty bad. And then there's all these areas here, and this is the land use we talk about. So they're heat traps, so it increases the temperature up to 3 degrees, but it's gotten rid of all grassy areas and whatever. So in this particular area, there was a 300% increase in land loss within 1 year with asphalt and concrete. What happens is that all these major cities have their own climate, totally different climate, different rates of precipitation, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? So all big cities now are controlling their own climates, and detrimentally, I have to say, all right? But the same thing here. Here's Kiribati, which will be the first island in the Pacific to disappear, then the Maldives. But Kiribati and all the Pacific islands have become urbanized. You think of that? You know, romantically, you don't want to hear that. All right? But they've all pulled into central locations. They have non-communicable disease rise, so they're getting obese, type 2 diabetes, a lot of psychosocial and depression problems, things like that. Kiribati is trying to get all their people to one place. They tried to get an island off New Zealand. New Zealand is taking them. They're taking about 1,000 people to be trained as nurses, and then when they get trained and get a job, then they'll bring their family in. But now they're looking to get about 100,000 of them, maybe to Fiji. The Maldives, the president wants the people, every country in the world, to take some of their people to remind them that there is such a thing as climate change. But even there's some legal things. If a country disappears, Kiribati and Maldives are countries, one of the 194. When they disappear, does that mean the nation disappears? Okay. There are interesting issues that we've never been faced with. But yes, that is going to disappear very, very soon. The bottom billion, how many remember reading Paul Collier's Bottom Billion? Yeah, I think a lot of you remember. But we've been making an awful lot of decisions like the MDGs and the budgets and where we send aid and things like that based on the population that he looked at in the 1990s, which told us something we said, oh, okay, yeah, well, we can buy this. 80% of the bottom billion in poverty were located in stable countries like Tanzania and Zambia, but also conflict-ridden ones like Congo and Burundi. Then Andrew Sumner comes along and uses more current data pool to find out where the bottom billion in poverty is living. And this was 93%, 72%. But look at the change. The majority of really poverty-ridden people are in middle-income stable countries and middle-income fragile affected states like Nigeria and Pakistan, but India, China, and Indonesia, right? Something we hadn't seen before. So this is changing how we're planning on aid and the MDGs and all the rest of the stuff. Also, infant immunizations, real efforts to get kids vaccinated for all the preventable diseases, the DPDs, those of you who have had kids. But yeah, we always think that it's the low-income countries that have the lowest rate, and this is where our programs are. But now we're finding that the highest rates where they're not getting the vaccination are in those countries, Indonesia, China, and India. So totally different. Biodiversity crises. There are many scientists who will tell you that this is our major crisis. We have just so many biodiverse areas, and I'll show you a picture of them. But believe it or not, this is where most of our vascular plants and vertebrae have lived, and they're really the biological oxygen of the world. But this is where we get food from. This provides us with fresh water. This is where we get a balance of infectious diseases or bacteria, viruses, protozoa, and everything, and because we all have it and we're exposed to it. But this balance to prevent actually invasive diseases from occurring occurs in this biodiverse area because it's there to ensure this stability in many areas in the world. Biodiversity hotspots occur when the habitat of vascular plants are greater than 1,500, or 70% of the original habitat is lost. And high biodiversity really is a major significant safeguard against infectious diseases. Biodiverse areas being lost in China, bet your life. Right now, China contributes 40% of all the new and re-emerging infectious diseases in the world. According to a UN report, that will go up to about 80% by 2030. Right? Remember SARS? Remember avian influenza? The reason being is that's where a large number of people, density-wise, live with a high number of dense waterfowl and chickens and those that are the vectors for these kinds of diseases. But the other thing is that 80% of the conflicts that we've had in the world occurred in 23 of the 34. We only have 34 major biodiverse areas in the world. And so when we have wars, essentially it gets rid of the biodiversity. So I don't know how well you can see this, but you can see the outline of continents. The gray areas are where the biodiversity areas are. The black spots are where there have been major conflicts in the last 50 years. So why would they be around? Yeah, everybody's looking to have the fuel, have the water. I mean, our fuel come from there, pollination, et cetera, but people will strive for that. Now, we don't have a Minister of Interior in Iraq right now, but when he was there about 2 years ago, he said, he was quoted in Foreign Affairs journal, but he said, "Thank God we have oil because we can now buy food for the people." Right? Now, this was a place that between the Tigris and the Euphrates River was just packed with vegetation. All right? They never had a problem with food, but they do now. And as a matter of fact, adding to the fact that a lot of it was destroyed with the war, hopefully you can see this is the Tigris and Euphrates River. And when they meet down there, can you see right here? What is that area where they meet? Did you hear the cradle of civilization? Okay, in the Bible, that's where it is. All right. So it's supposed to, abundant with food and all the rest of the stuff. It's dry as a bone now. All right. But the other thing is that the Tigris and Euphrates River begin in Syria and Turkey, and they both built dams. So right now, the Tigris and Euphrates River, in many places, is just down to a trickle. So maybe when times when it could have been negotiated, quite honestly, the war has built this ecological monster for that particular country. We do have what we call protected areas, and this is for land-based and marine life. But as you can see, as the increase in protected areas are built or biodiverse areas are trying to be brought back, quite honestly, the number of species and plants and all the rest of the stuff has continued to go down. Why? Well, a lot of it's been continually deforested. Habitats have moved in. Budget constraints, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of, not much attention to it. So we're losing that too. But When we do have a disaster, we usually have something like this. So restocking of the genetic resources is critical after disasters. But it's really science. If you put in the wrong species, they will take over. Okay? As a matter of fact, one of the issues that does occur with war is that invasive species go in and take over. And that's one of the reasons why we have more re-emerging and new emerging infectious diseases from China. Because they're stronger and they can assume dominance. Climate change, I'm not going to bore you too much with this, but easy to think of it in terms of different environmental indicators. So climate change, biodiversity, which I just went over, about global cycles of nitrogen and phosphorus. Just remember that nitrogen is renewable, that we can do on the earth, but phosphorus is not. And our phosphorus stores are decreasing about 2% every single year. But 50% of all the phosphorus in the world is in Morocco. Morocco, every country wants to be friends with Morocco, okay? Unless they intend to invade them to get this. But that's a real problem, okay? Is it is part of that dream to get these raw materials from asteroids? Yes. Okay. Or at the deep sea. But phosphorus is a big one. The planet may go under simply because of that. Ocean acidification, certainly off Oregon, has changed completely, so a lot of bottom feeders are gone, crabs. That's why you see actually more big fish bites, because they have to go to the surface to get the oxygen that they need and even the food. That's why we're seeing a lot more shark and other kinds of bio. Ozone, the land use that I told you about in China. So if you cross one boundary of any of these, it affects the stability of the entire system. And I think you know that pretty well. The El Nino, which is supposed to have disappeared, we'll see what happens. But during El Nino years, in those areas in red, the warmer the El Nino, the higher the conflict. It's actually doubled during that period of time. Why do we have conflict? Well, a lot of things have changed, but probably it's due to the fact that agricultural production has dropped in these areas. So it's competition for the available agriculture that's producing conflict. Easy to explain. Australia, we think this just belongs to the developing country. Australia, very highly developed, but among the developed countries, Australia is really hurting. An increased frequency and aggressiveness of the climate change effects. So talk to some Aussie, they'll tell you right up front what's happened. But it's the most vulnerable one that we have, but rising temperatures, lower overall rainfall, except in other areas where they never had rains before, so heavy rains and floods in, let's say, the west and certainly on the eastern side, where there can be both a combined drought and then a lot of frequent rain like you see in the southern part of the United States. Worse, the western part of Perth, which is usually dry, now the worst mosquito breeding because they've ever seen, because they have much more water. So the infectious diseases, malaria, Ross River virus, melioidosis, dengue, are all then moving south. Remember, they move south down towards Sydney. And increased infectious diseases, if you look at ProMed or things like that, you start seeing things about melioidosis, Ross River fever, and whatever outbreaks in Australia. This picture in the background, anybody recognize that? But that's the Opera House in Sydney, totally covered. That was not, that's the way it looked. They didn't tint that. But the Opera House in Sydney just covered with a super dust storm. And so they're really quite frightened about the whole thing for good reason. Weather-related disasters, yes, that has increased in number and frequency, that we can tell you as scientists. And the mortality has increased. Okay. This does not count earthquakes because it's not weather-related. Maybe not so true. Because this past couple of weeks, again, an article has come out and said, you know what? We're trying to figure out why we're also seeing more earthquakes. But with all the rain, the flooding, there's been soil erosion time after time after time. And what they figure and these are areas where the earthquakes are now occurring, is that it's gotten rid of this mantle that actually has had weight on it to contain the earthquake's potential. So remove that, the earthquake will occur. So it is probably, then we can include it in that list. What can we tell as scientists? Well, science can project the frequency of extreme weather and how it might change as the globe warms. Easy correlation with heat waves. Russia last year had 54,000 heat wave deaths. Russia. Intense rainfall, and those matched with CO2 emissions. Yes, scientists are pretty clear about that. More difficult where there are many confounding variables involved, like with Somalia. Pretty much the scientists now say, yeah, the droughts in Somalia, whatever, it is a climate change issue. But what you're also dealing with is the terrain, no good management of the crops, bad soils and things like that. So it's a little bit harder. But in this past year, the science has overcome not working together. So there's much more interdisciplinary work. So you can get some modeling from just loss of grass, of loss of forest, or loss of water, but they've been independent. Now they're doing the modeling all together, and they say, woo, this really has shown some changes. So yes, guilty of scientists sort of doing it separately, but now they're working together, and so the science is much more accurate because it is multidisciplinary and more highly integrated. As I told you, when I went to China, 83% of the population were suffering from malnutrition and severe poverty. And look, in a very short period of time, this has never happened to any other country, and I doubt it will ever, but they moved down their poverty and malnutrition rate. As a matter of fact, their poverty rate is better than the poverty rate in the United States. But how did they do this? It was a singular focus of building industry. Right? And as a matter of fact, their foreign policy, which is quite robust, but it is the same thing. They are so proud of the fact that they turned their country around with intense industrialization that in the African countries, they are bringing the same industry to them. Okay? That's their singular focus at the time. An unfortunate thing is that, in the United States, but also in China, in Cuba, in Spain, and in Russia, foreign policy is driving health policy, and health policy is driving foreign policy, right? But it's very competitive, very governmental centric, and they're competing. So, the Chinese now, they were very embarrassed. They didn't have a hospital ship during the tsunami, so they've built one, the Peace Ark. Peace Ark goes to Africa, zoom, big meetings in D.C., and we got to send the hospital ships to Africa. They just do some primary health care and then they leave. It's not what we want. An awful lot of money being put into what, and it's avoiding the real global initiatives, even develop strategies, as I said, for nuclear threats. We are not doing it because we're still very competitive. Can we work together? I don't know. I mean, that's a big thing. But this group here that's still having poverty is that gap, okay, the gap analysis, income inequity. And where would you think is the income inequity for the United States? Anybody offer a figure or where we might lie? How we rate with the rest of the world? Well, we're rated number 93. But guess what? We're 3 percentage points behind Iran, 12 behind China, and 50 percentage points behind Egypt. When you start getting this big gap, there's more chance, as we know historically, for violence. You have to think of that in the future. Our infant mortality rate, you know about those things. Quite honestly, it is what we call a composite indice. It tells us more about good governance than anything else. I am a pediatrician, among other things, but yeah, infant mortality, we think about antenatal, prenatal, postnatal care, education, things like that. Well, it's more than that. We have good prenatal programs, but that doesn't mean the infant mortality rate goes down. It really is the most sensitive indicator, and the economists use it. Everybody uses it in government to really test good governance. So it's education, it's communication, it's transportation, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? we were, I'm 72, when I was a lot of your ages, we would compete for the first or second spot with Cuba, which had a good primary health care system, but they only started counting infant deaths after 2 days of birth, okay? And so they were always leading us. Last year we were rated number 19. This year we're rated number 42nd, behind Slovenia. But we're a composite. We're 50 different countries. So we have absolutely remarkable infant mortality rates in Massachusetts and Vermont, but ones that are comparable to the third world in Mississippi and Alabama and Louisiana. So the composite is pulling that down. Also, what does that have to do with disasters? Well, it also is a really good, because it's a good measure of governance, is their capacity to really respond to any kind of crisis, even natural disasters. Okay, and think about Katrina. Right? Louisiana didn't get the, Mississippi didn't get the hit that Louisiana did, but boy, did they recover much quicker, okay, because they had that. So these kinds of things do tell us. Matter of fact, The Economist, believe it or not, how many of you have seen the magazine The Economist? You know about it? Yeah, it's really great. But about 10 years ago now, they had a half-page article about urban decay and how they would measure urban decay. Now, they didn't check with me, and I don't think they checked with any other epidemiologists or scientists or whatever, but they came up with the most sensitive indicator for urban decay was dengue fever. All right? And so I'm reading the article, and they went through all sorts of machinations. But why dengue fever? Well, when there is urban decay and the government has just so many funds, what do? They stop picking up the trash. So there's much more trash around, which are now styrofoam cups and tin cans filled with water, great breeding point for the mosquitoes. Right. So for them, it's the most sensitive indicator of urban decay. We tend to use the same thing. Now here is an important slide, because the blue areas are those countries that are little or no water scarcity. So, if it's not with us, I'm a psychiatrist also, so I can read your minds, by the way. Just watch what you do. But, denial is our most powerful defense mechanism. So when unimaginable things like nuclear threats or whatever, it's just blocked out. Okay. It starts in adolescence, when they're caught doing something, it's right in front of them. Oh, I didn't do it. Okay. So it's with us all our life. But we're not stressed with that. But you can see in the red areas, which are North Africa, certainly, the Sahelian countries, and China, etc., but also economic water scarcity, which is all very important. So when we look at China, water scarcity in 2/3 of those now 600 cities, and also in the rural areas, because they're trying to move the industry to the west, because you just see all the lights and everything at night, and it's all on the East Coast, but it's just terrible. So they're moving it, but there's not enough water even to do coal mining. And they're drilling wells, they're taking it from lakes, but the farmers don't have any water now. So the agricultural system is suffering. But and they're seeing the farmers, which were right on the top of the list before, are now second-class citizens. But 80% of these cities have no sewage treatment facilities. Can you imagine a city anywhere in North America that doesn't? 90% of the groundwater is polluted. All of this waste from homes, from businesses, factories, etc., go into lakes, ponds, and rivers. Right? So all of this goes, however, east to the South China Sea, right? Along with a number of chemicals, etc. So it alters the ecosystem. Normal bacteria are killed off, algae grow, different protozoa viruses. There are things in the water that the scientists say we don't even have the capacity of recognizing what they are. And are they pathogenic? Are they not? Okay. This is what happens. This is on the South China Sea coast. So as the chemicals and the new bacteria and protozoa and everything come in, they die off or they kill off each other. But algae is one of those things that, given the chance, you know, we have fungus on our skin, you know. If we use too much soap and things like that, we end up getting a rash, which is actually fungal. Okay, the diaper rash is the big thing. What does the pediatrician tell you? I'm also a pediatrician. Just say, stop the damn soap. You know, just let it air dry and it goes away. You don't have to do anything else. All right. But this is massive, giant algae, and covered 83% of the coast. The Chinese army are the ones that actually handle disasters. The armies actually handle 70% of all the disasters in Asian countries. But they had to get rid of this. It came back and they had to get rid of it again. But this is the consequence of it coming from the inland, okay? Pretty bad. This is Shanghai, obviously. Then there's Yunnan Lake, which is right close to a factory, a lead-producing factory. So we have lead poisoning in children. When I was a resident in Yale, we had lead poisoning in children from kids eating the old paint from the old homes. But, you know, that's unheard of now in the United States. But the highest rates now are in China because of those things. But you can imagine what else is in there. There are fluorides, there are sulfates, there's arsenic. All right? And this all comes down to the South China Sea. I hope you can see this, but you can see all the cabanas all the way here, the dense, you know, yeah. Density, you know, is like pornography. I don't know how to define it, but I know it when I see it, okay? But, you know, when I have an audience of mostly public health people, well, non-public health people, they'll say, gee, I wonder, where did you get a hot dog or hamburger there? But when you have a public health audience, they say, my God, where are the toilets? You know damn well where the toilets are, don't you? Okay? So first off, just getting into that water that has had all those things sent from the West, plus this, you can understand why they have the majority of emerging and re-emerging diseases. Now, but this is a population that 6-7 years ago would never, ever think they had the right or the opportunity to go to a beach. Okay. So in a lot of situations, whether it's populations or governments, they don't know what they don't know. So that's, you know, going back to the NLM issues. How do we inform the population? Because we're never going to solve these things without having an informed population. This is all chemicals in this particular lake. But gastrointestinal cancers, so esophageal, stomach cancers, bowel cancers, are the #1 cause of death in rural China. No other country even like it. Okay. And also, this is in Beijing. Pollution, 40% of all the pollution deaths, whether they're air and water, come from China. But the pollution is certainly causing like just the heat with the asphalt and concrete, but changes in temperature and rainfall. So it's very widespread throughout all of China, and you'll see some views from space. But this particular day, the pollution level was considered acceptable. So in China, they don't use the international standards, and they also have a different standard for Beijing than in Hong Kong, because they want the tourists to come there. You know, if you ever want to have a meeting in China, they'll say, oh, come in May, because at least you might see some blue sky, but otherwise it's like this. But I can't imagine this guy flying a kite. I mean, 30 meters up, he's not even going to see it. But this is Tiananmen Square. Okay? So this is what they live with every single day. Okay? So certainly, and the Lancet has had, Lancet actually has gone and put an office in Beijing to try to get the best science and help them write articles. So these articles written on respiratory problems in adults and children are coming from Chinese scientists. And it's interesting that the government is allowing this to happen, because the data is absolutely horrible. It really is. Okay? So where does this all come from? Not just from themselves, because this stuff crosses border. But obviously this is India, this is the Tibetan Plateau, and this is China. But see this little area up here, the pale circular area? That's the Chengdu Plain. It's the 4th largest city, an agricultural and economic center. Right? But the prevailing winds go up, hit the Tibetan Plateau, and then sort of go, and when they hit China, it's usually up there. So let's just take a look at this. This is India, Bangladesh, Southeast Asia. Again, the circle area is the Chengdu Plateau. And India is all coal burning. All right? So all of this butts up against the Tibetan Plateau. And then as it hits the Chengdu Plain in that direction. And here it is, if you can see, this is like an X-ray. Everything that's white is really coal black. Okay? So it's always the reverse, like when you're getting a chest X-ray. All right? So it's all of this coal here that's hitting the Tibetan Plateau and then starts with the prevailing winds going. This spot here where everything seems to stop is the Chengdu Plain before it goes further into China. Okay? So ends up there. And this is when there's not much, but not only the Chengdu Plain, but because of industry just really covering all of China. Totally unprecedented. All right? Now, when I was in Chengdu, believe it or not, there was a climate change meeting, and I was one of the speakers. But this was sponsored by the CDC in Atlanta, the CDC in Beijing, and the CDC in Shanghai. But, you know, Chinese don't say, hey, gee, you know, hon, let's go visit Chengdu. You know, if our family didn't live there, they're not going to travel there. Okay? But the CDC people from Shanghai and Beijing, when they got to Chengdu, said, oh, my God, all right, this is terrible. We were told not to leave the hotel. Okay? It was that bad. We could not breathe outside. Great place for a climate change meeting, all right? So the scientists started complaining. Said, you know, you got to be doing something about this. So finally a Chinese scientist or official stood up, and this is what he said. I'm afraid you'll have to live with it, a disease of civilization. There is no cure. So they have to follow the plan because industry is going to come first and change the economics, not necessarily how well you live in life. Emergencies of scarcity is something you need to know. Not much written. Stuff by Evans is really great. But, you know, we would normally judge the public health infrastructure and capacity of a country based on infant mortality rate and how well education, communication, things like that, maternal mortality rate, all those sensitivities. But increasingly, gang, countries are being judged by how much energy, water, and food they have. So that's defining the health status of a country. Because it doesn't make any difference if they don't have that, they're not surviving. So resource competition is occurring and becoming very aggressive, and I'll give you an example of that in a minute. But they're called distributional conflicts because people get injured and they also get killed. You're saying, well, I haven't heard about that. The reason being is that we only start counting deaths as war when it's over 1,000 per year. Right now, it's very, very prevalent, but it hasn't gone over that top. So we're not really counting those things. Right? Escalating food prices leading to stunting. You know what stunting is? Stunting is when you don't get enough protein in your food in the first 5 years of life, so you know you're smaller than normal. All right? That's chronic malnutrition versus acute malnutrition that might happen because there's a war and there's no food. Okay? So you can get chronic and acute malnutrition on top of each other, and that's a pretty bad situation. Okay? So we're seeing a change in that. And this actually is a kid who, if you saw him completely, he's 5 years of age. But see how long his arms are? He would look like an alien. And yeah, he can sit upright, won't faint, because it's chronic and his physiologic system has adapted to that. If he had acute malnutrition, you pick up his head and he'd start feeling faint and you have to go down. Right? So this is what chronic looks like. And he looks like really about a 3-year-old. But yeah, we would expect that in Africa, but quite honestly, we're really stopping stunting in Africa. This is Guatemala. Guatemala? You know, you can fly down there now. You'll see great open-air markets, great food, avant-garde, you know, condos and nightlife and things like that. But the food prices have increased 83%. So look at this, 50% of the children have stunting. I mean, that's shameful. But if you're a Mayan, so a vulnerable group like the Maoris and the Aboriginals and things like that, it's 80% stunting. Okay? So this is really just because they cannot afford food. Land grabbing is what occurs, and there are countries that have a lot of money, what we call import dependent. Who are they? China, South Korea, Japan, Russia, and a few Middle Eastern countries. So they don't have enough fresh water, they don't have enough food, but they have the money from industry and whatever to go ahead and buy resources. I was giving a speech in New Zealand a couple of years ago, and from the airport into Auckland, the taxi driver was showing me, and all of New Zealand, I should have showed you on the map, all of New Zealand is a biodiverse area, okay? It's green all the time. But he was pointing out all these different lands and then islands that the Japanese have purchased. And unfortunately, in his ignorance, he says, I can't believe they're going to build hotels on all of them. No, they're not. They're going to grow rice, all right? But they're putting this stuff in the bank. Now, there are a lot of stories, but you need to hear about Madagascar. You know where that is? And off goes Africa. But it's a dirt-poor country, high unemployment, etc. But they have a large, large biodiverse area. Matter of fact, all forestry. Okay? It's a big biodiverse area that the world wants to keep. But over a 3-year period, the South Koreans negotiated with the political power in Madagascar for a 100-year no-cost lease for half of all the arable land in the country. This was in the press, things like that. People saying, gee, this, should this be done, whatever. Then all of a sudden the population, which they were counting on would just be over their head, actually there was a political revolt. And even though it was signed, the first thing they did is nullify this contract. Okay? So, guess what South Korea said? Because their statement is very revealing. We want to plant corn. It's not rice, it's corn. That's their main food. To ensure our food security. Food can be a weapon in this world. So these countries already know that it's going to be, the future wars are going to be over food, energy, water, all right? More than anything else. Okay? So very, very telling. I think it's a good story and true one that you need to know. The future food-related wars probably going to occur. This is China, Vietnam, where I spent a good amount of time, Taiwan, Philippines, all the way down to Malaysia. But this line is what's called the China 9 dash line, so you can pull it up on the web. And this is historical, so China sort of has the leg up. But this is why China claims that they own all the fisheries. So you've heard about the contention over the Spratly Islands, the Paracel Islands. And you'll have islands, which is nothing more than, this big, sticking out of the water. And whether it's the Philippines or another country or China, they actually have a structure on it with some guns. All right? You need to know that just a year ago, the president of Vietnam mobilized his entire army because there was a conflict with China over the fishing rights right off the coast of Vietnam. This is their food. Okay? This is a great place for fishing. They could get rid of it pretty quickly. But so this is a place of contention and will be. So keep your eyes on that for sure, because it's a problem area. Emerging infectious diseases, please understand, it's just an absolutely wonderful time to be a virus. It really is. And think about it. Viruses mutate every single second, okay? In the 1918s, the virus actually just mutated once, and the mutation was to allow them to transmit themselves to human beings. Avian influenza has mutated. Matter of fact, if all of you had avian influenza, let's say over a 2-month period, and right now under the international health regulations, we would get live virus samples from all of you, they would genetically all be different because they constantly change. But the interesting thing about avian influenza is that it has not changed to where there would be a human-to-human transmission. Okay? Could it happen? Yes. So remember when H1N1 happened in 2009, and China and Japan wouldn't let anybody in? Who's the mayor of one of the cities? He was there for a speech, and they quarantined him. All right. The thing is that they have avian influenza there, and if they brought in H1N1, which is not high mortality, matter of fact, very low, but it's easily transmissible from human to human. If those two viruses got together, then you have a high mortality one that is easily transmissible. That's what they were doing. All right. So, as I said before, 70% of all the new and re-emerging diseases come from Southeast Asia primarily. It's the density of populations and animal markets and easy travel that we haven't had. And as I said, there's 100 research studies done from WHO in one manual that just came out this year showing that with the warming ocean, so the Vibrio genus that cholera is now going north and can be seen in presenting with food poisoning and things like that. But the whole way in which how cholera has gotten around the world just with exploration, whatever, but now it's being helped. Right? Now we blamed, cholera is in the Caribbean, but it was never in Haiti. We don't know why when there was an epidemic in the 1990s, Haiti was not hit. Okay? And then of course they had it was blamed on the UN troops from Nepal. But I'm not so sure that, because they got it from the water off the coast, that this was not also part of the problem. Plague is increasing. This is I had to manage a massive bubonic plague epidemic in Vietnam in '68. The important thing here is that people look at infectious diseases entirely different. We have a population of Hmong in Long Beach, the largest one, about 40,000 people. But there's nothing in their vocabulary about infectious diseases. Okay? How do you inform them? How do you educate them if indeed there's a pandemic? Understand? They don't. There's nothing in there about infectious diseases. Certainly wasn't. We couldn't talk about bacteria and viruses and how things happen even in Vietnam. But this also, when there was a plague outbreak, maybe about 9 years ago in India, 900,000 people fled, even in China, into Pakistan, and whatever. Doctors did too, and they threatened the doctors with prison and death if they didn't come back. And there were only like 49 cases. But this is just to show you, and this is the kind of thing that exists today. The bubo was right here. They put pasty white stuff, lime around it to contain it. They didn't understand. This was pasty stuff. Unfortunately, a kid's arm hit it, but with Chinese writing. So they see the Chinese as fathers of medicine. And then onion flakes in the hair to contain the fever. This kid was comatose. I said, well, this is the second day, and this is my 5th or 6th case of plague. And I said, boy, I got to take this picture. So you can see the mother standing. As soon as the flash went off, the kid had a grand mal convulsion. Probably would have happened anyways because 50% of the kids I treated all had febrile convulsions, right? Prolonged febrile convulsions. So more probably due to the toxins and the bacteria itself. But of course, they perceive a seizure as evil spirits. If you're well, you have good spirits. If you're sick, you have evil spirits. That's as far as infectious disease goes. So this thing that I had in my hand produced that. Okay, so she ran out. We had to send the Marines after her. So she said she'd come back, but I was not supposed to see the child. I was the only one, so I managed it from a distance. Okay, and the kid did perfectly fine. But this is the kind of thing you see that we're dealing with in most of the developing countries where we have that. And that impedes our ability to contain these things. And if we look at the global distribution of plague, when I came back from Vietnam, they were beginning to build homes in Southern California and Arizona and New Mexico, where they hadn't before. But they had plague among woodchucks and squirrels. You know, squirrels are just rats with fuzzy tails, and things like that. But they were building homes, and they had 50 cases of human plague during that time. So I was contacted, because I had published an article about the epidemic just in children. And so that was back in 1969. But as you can see, every country west of the Mississippi, every state west of the Mississippi have had a human or an animal case of plague since that time. You don't know about it, do you? Okay, you don't hear about it. There was in Chicago a researcher on plague who died in the last couple of years. but you see it in India and places like that where, it still has the aura of what you saw in the slide from Vietnam. But the reason why is that we have public health surveillance, we have a good public health infrastructure. They take care of it. But that's not the way it is. So pretty much whether it's something becomes an emerging or widespread depends on the public health infrastructure and the surveillance. So remember, the international health regulations were mandated after SARS. Remember what SARS happened? That we were getting rumors. Actually, the first person out was a Chinese physician who came to a meeting. That's all he could talk about, okay? So people started sending emails, things like that. Everybody knew that something was going on. And WHO, World Health Organization, who had emergency teams, well, it just had passive. They could say to the country, we're here if you need us, all right? China just said, there's nothing here, nothing here. No, don't worry about it, okay? Finally, they gave in because the rumors and everything were getting, but they had something bad in China. So they allowed the WHO team to come in. They landed in Beijing, which is a distance away airport, distance away from Beijing itself. When they landed, they had thousands of patients with SARS in the hospitals, but they took all but a handful of patients out. They put them in buses, taxis, and ambulances, and drove around Beijing for as long as that WHO team was there. All right. So the WHO team said, yeah, it's an interesting disease, but certainly not an epidemic, and so they left. That's when the World Health Ministry, all the ministers of health are part of the World Assembly of Health Ministers, which is part of the UN. They realized, oh my God, we have a problem. So they met, and in less than 24 hours, they took the World Health Organization from a passive organization and gave them tremendous authority to go into any country. If you're a signatory to the UN, okay, that's like the International Red Cross, the Geneva Conventions, treaty, you can't, change it. So they went in, and this is when we started doing it, okay? And WHO was learning, but look what happened. And they quarantined Toronto. Right? Do you know anybody know why they quarantined Toronto? Historically, we never had anything like that, and nobody had the power to quarantine someplace like Toronto. Anybody have any idea? Well, the thing is that, yeah, this is where most of the cases were in Canada, but the hospitals weren't sending the information, what they needed, deaths, illness, things like that, to the central public health center. The doctors were saying, no, I'm not going to share this with anybody. I want to write this up, okay? WHO, what was WHO's responsibility? To be sure that was not going to go from Toronto to another country to contain it. They weren't getting the data, so they essentially punished Toronto by quasi-quarantining it. And it went on for 14 weeks. The business community said, come on, we're losing tourism. Like somebody was going to go to Toronto with the SARS there. And so they let up after about 12 weeks. And a week later, 2 weeks later, they had the second wave of SARS, which was actually worse than the first. So they're stronger now. They know what to do. And it actually has worked well. So the response differences really depend on the public health infrastructure and the protections that they provide. Nuclear threats, this is the last thing before we get to the conclusions, but I told you the countries that have just stopped their nuclear plants. But you need to know that 2/3 of the nuclear power plants have more people living within 30 kilometers, which was the distance that they removed people from surrounding Fukushima. Okay? 400,000 people were evacuated to shelters. Okay? So all of them would have really, really high. But again, it has to do with population density. It's very, very critical. So 21 out of those 211 have at least 1 million people within 75 kilometers. Now, there was a French reactor that went off, Chernobyl one, 3 Mile Island. People think, they were old plants. No, even the Chernobyl one was a new plant, fairly new plant. The Fukushima plant, if you didn't know, was supposed to shut down 2 weeks after this happened, so because it was old enough. Right? So that was but most of the time, when accidents occur, they occur because there's lack of training, lack of quality of maintenance, competency of the operators, workforce complacency, no regulatory oversight. Do you know what? The job is absolutely boring. Okay. We now have, because most of them are retiring, but we have 26,000 openings for people to work in these plants. And of course, we're building 2 more. So those are the things. But the challenge to the emergency medical system, which what I'm going to mention here, nobody's addressing. Mass evacuation. You know, Utah had a virtual one of 1 million people, but it doesn't make any difference if you don't move all those people out. Okay. Triage protocols. I'm an elected member of the Institute of Medicine. We did have one on nuclear triage a couple of years ago. I was not happy with it because all military trauma led. And that's not the way it is, okay, with these things. Mass sheltering. You know, in Japan, all these elderly Japanese people, and you always see, you know, when you're elderly, you walk every day, you ride bicycles, they're as healthy as can be. They've gone into their shelters, and there's been an endemic of deep vein thrombosis and pulmonary emboli. They're dying like flies because they're very much like the urbanization in the islands, okay? They're having pulmonary emboli also if you change your activities, okay? So mass sheltering, God, all these things we need to do real big research on. But also, when you're a worker, we need to take blood from you in order to then have, to provide stem cell transfusions if indeed you get radiation exposure. That's not done. All right? That's not the time to do it. Well, we just published an article looking at the nuclear threat in the Middle East between Iran and Israel. And it's interesting, we sent it off to a journal, which I'm on the editorial board, but sort of go through the common review process, but I don't know how it happened, and I don't want to know, but anyways, it was sent to the CIA. The CIA says, no, you know, you can't publish this. We sent it to another journal, and it was accepted that day, and it is in the literature. I'd like to have you read it, and you tell me, but the big thing about this is not only do the public not know about this is one of these things that unimaginable. But when you look at the international negotiations that are going on, the health consequences are never mentioned. But I will tell you that if there was an exchange, there was a nuclear weapon that hit Israel, more Muslims would be killed. You wouldn't go to Lebanon, Jordan, Israel at all for 40 plus years. People need to know that, okay? It's not something that is easily done. So the conclusions, first off, humanitarian assistance is moving from the rural to the urban areas. But what we're having is an increased have and have-not population, much more since Alma Ata in the 1950s when there was an intent to try to get, you know, every country in good state with women and children by the year 2000, okay? Humanitarian community is not prepared to protect the urban public health. I mean, where would you start drilling for a well here, okay, if all of that went down, or electricity and things like that, all right? And certainly not prepared to handle the emergencies of scarcity because, again, it's all one country or the other and those that are purchasing these resources, and whether they actually have a right then to survive rather than even the country that they're getting the resources from. I mean, there's all sorts of ethical, moral, and other issues that are not covered under international law. I mean, we're still way back at the Geneva Conventions, which nobody is even recognizing now. You know, it wasn't recognized in the Iraq War, which was certainly a violation. But so we don't really have much to fall back on. But we have to stop celebrating China. I mean, I've heard so many politicians this past year say we've got to be more like China. What that translates into is that they want less regulations. And I think you've seen what happens when you have less regulations. I think we're at the tipping point in a lot of environmental things. But again, the people don't know. But, and surprised how many people when I show these slides, oh, I didn't know it was that bad. But that's what happened. No, we don't have to be more like China. We don't. And when our economy was good, we weren't like that, okay? But again, importantly, future crises are going to be solved by global health initiatives, not by individual nation states alone. So push that at cocktail parties if you could, for sure. But the greatest challenges are at the local community level, where there are increasing disparities between equity and public health capacities, because they're the last ones that are going to get any funding. So you know the disaster cycle: prevention, preparedness, response, and recovery. I think everybody heard about that. That's the basis. And also within strategic, tactical, and local level things. But it's a top-down kind of thing. All right? And during the pandemic, they did studies afterwards in all continents of the world where there was a SARS threat. And the strategic and tactical plans were excellent. But everything fell apart at the local level. It didn't make any difference how good they were, okay? And in Australia, the GPs, they have a big primary health care site. The GPs own medicine there, and they're strong, and everybody has a GP. So they're not going to show up in the emergency room without the GP telling them to go, all right? But the GP said it was an endemic failure of the Australian emergency management system to keep them both informed and with the resources that they needed, like antivirals and what have you, okay? But informed. Okay? So what's happening certainly in Australia is they're changing everything. They're going from a bottom up where the community is in the driver's seat. So let's say on the East Coast where there's flooding or whatever, they've gone in with resources and they realize, oh God, it's not the right ones. So they're putting that in the lap of the community to do their own anticipation and assessments, and then that information goes up to the region. They decide on what resources are needed, et cetera, et cetera. So it's putting the community. Communities are really very good. As a matter of fact, one of the mistakes that we make is to assume that there's no expertise at the community level. But like the other ones I was talking about, what the community will ask for is, give us information. Okay? If that isn't a role for the medical specialists, librarian specialists, I don't know what, okay? We have 2,800 public health departments in the United States. They are underfunded, under-resourced. Where did they get their information? Oh, they'll get some from CDC and things like that. But what is relevant to their community at the time? So there's a big, big need for what you guys are doing in Dimrick, okay? You need to know that, and I could expand on that a lot. But Melinda Moore, who used to be with CDC, she's now at RAND, but she just looked at 10 countries who went through these massive disasters and looked at community resilience and what we could learn in the United States from that. And the elements of community resilience that are needed are community education. Well, you guys use that article. I think I sent it to you. Community empowerment. You don't bypass the community. Practice social networks and familiarity with local services, which the government agencies don't know. And Joplin will tell you when it happened. We didn't have the federal government. We took care of ourselves. But you need to know that it was in 2006 when the White House came out with an advisory that said that the federal government is only in an advisory role. It's up to the communities, okay? But it was probably put out on a Friday when nobody knows, all right? But most of the communities in the country think that the federal government's going to come on a white horse to save them. And that's not going to happen, all right? So we need to start working on that and catch up with places like Australia, New Zealand, and others that are becoming much more community prepared. The conclusion is also, it's false that better scientific information, which is out there, leads to better decisions among political decision makers. Why? Well, certainly they are not looking at the benefits of research. By that time, they're more concerned with solving the societal problems because that's what the constituents are complaining about. So they don't help it. But the reality is that the relationship between researchers, scientists, and political decision makers is the worst it's ever been. And there's articles written about how bad it is in France, how bad it is in Italy, how bad it is in the UK. I work with the UK a lot, and they say, we're not doing any research anymore. Just none. All political decisions, especially when there's austerity, okay? You're not going to get funded the new satellites that are needed, the low ones, to figure out, the climate change, but also the weather information. They're not going to be funded. Matter of fact, it's dropped by a third, and it's going to continue to drop for the next 5 years, okay? Politicians listen to economists. They don't listen to scientists. They do not read scientific journals, and they're very threatened by them. Scientists don't make good lobbyists. There was even an article in I think it was Nature, that, and no pun intended when they wrote it, they said, we scientists probably should join the Republican Party, at least get into it, know the enemy. I mean, it's out there. It's for you to read, okay, if you want to. But Congress, the other thing, when I talk about multidisciplinary, I mean, when I ask people like you to do searches, you give me what's on Medline and PubMed. No, I want the social sciences. I want political sciences. I want civil engineering. I want law, okay? Because the solutions are really contained with all of those things. So the searches have got to be widened. But researchers knew this with the social sciences, and that you would think would be important to the political decision makers. But they've been, quote, expelled from the process as the funding has dropped. There's collaborative, what we saw, citizen science, which is the information there, but also using the community as researchers, as stakeholders in the research, so we know what's really going on. But global science has got to be interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary. The single discipline approach, which was based on false science, is pretty much, look, we can take care of our own problems, but that's false. Both political powers, unfortunately, parties, as of today, have refused to debate science on the TV. That's a pretty bad commentary. But political ignorance of science, I feel, and others have written about this, and there's a lot of editorial commentary, is really a failure of governance. And Liz Lerman, who actually was a visiting lecturer, but she's a ballet dancer, but she was a visiting lecturer at Harvard. But this quote, ask a big enough question and you need more than one discipline to answer it. So I think that may be, you can't do what you need to do for the community or for politicians or anything until, quite honestly, you start stretching out from just science and Medline and PubMed. Am I scaring the living daylights out of you? Okay. But you need to know that. So last slide, global health must take precedence over politics. Woo, what a dreamer I am. And not be driven by political motives, but public health emergencies, the common thread that we've been talking about, must be seen as a strategic and security issue. And I've seen one other article recently that almost used the same words. So I think they took it from an article of mine, even though they didn't reference it. That deserves new professionals, okay? And among that, because information is extremely important, an international monitoring system, and a community focus. And the last slide is business will get involved. You can go to Sydney Airport and you can buy some climate change chocolate. It's their humor, but that's been around for 3 or 4 years now. So that's it. I don't know whether you have questions or we have time for questions. Does anybody have some questions?
We're going to have questions. We have to present you with a wonderful certificate.
Thank you.
Just begins to express our gratitude for this
Now,
inspiring talk.
Well, this has been
challenging talk.
Yeah, I hope so.
Threatening, fearful talk.
Yes, thanks. Thank you. Psychiatrists are supposed to make people anxious, right? Then they get better.
We'll try a question too.
Anybody? Did you learn anything from this? Okay. Are you angry?
Scared?
Yeah. But it's doable. But if we can start doing some of these things just by one nation state, but globally, but that's the real issue. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. I think one of the big things that came out of this and that I've heard before and kind of experienced before is the issue of political boundaries, political will, political everything kind of in it being the context in which we need to work. And there was a whole lot about the fact that we need to deal with that, but how? And so, it's not about the one nation state, but everything we have to do is within the context of people who maybe don't understand what we're trying to do or why or how or see the value in it and funding it. Yeah. So you're looking for new professionals. Well, they're coming out of school, they're broke, there's no money to be made, there's no, so it's like all these other issues. Where do we start? How do you begin?
Yeah, it is important. I'm glad you mentioned that because I want to tell you a little bit about Afghanistan in that regard. But it's interesting, at Johns Hopkins did not know this. You know, schools of public health, their duty is to train people to work in public health departments, okay? And a lot of people are retiring. But, you know, the international programs, primarily Harvard, Hopkins, Columbia, a lot of people in the international programs there. But Johns Hopkins did not know this, but it happened about a decade ago, I think you remember. All of a sudden they realized that they had engineers, attorneys, economists going in and, for their MPHs, okay? Because they knew that there was a public health component to their profession. We also have a population of young people who they may not be talking to you about it, but they know that their productive year is going to be doing something that's global. A decade ago, we had about 100,000 people in the world who called them their profession. They said, my professional career is a humanitarian professional, maybe logistician, manager, healthcare provider, things like that. It's now up to 250,000, and it's increasing 6% a year. Okay? A lot of people taking global health programs, getting master's degrees, and then having trouble getting jobs. Yeah, I know, it's really sad. But sometime it's going to start coming together, I hope. But I will tell you that your generation right now does not have a political voice, and that's a big part of it. So when some people die off, if you want me to name names, I think that that population, the young population, if they do have political power, will move in those directions. It'll be forced on us in lots of different ways, which it is now. You know, the fact that the Council on Foreign Relations had their first meeting, you know, just deal with it when most of us have been dealing with it for a long time. It was amazing how, as neophytes, or they were reinventing the world, okay? So we know what status they're at, and they're not going to be our decision makers until they know a heck of a lot more. So the knowledge base has got to be there. But they've got to get themselves out of that nation-state thing to really think globally. And I don't know. I'm going to be long dead before that really happens. But it will be your generation that will push those buttons, I think. I'm optimistic about that because there's just too many of you that really know those things. Okay. I think there was one back there first. Yes, Bill.
Hi, Skip.
Hi.
Just to follow that question, every one of your summary statements basically supports, in my view, the emerging concept of humanitarian or disaster relief and what we used to call development, sustainable development. And they're coming together. We're looking at interdisciplinary. I've often quoted you with attribution your statement that we have to learn to responsibly trespass professional boundaries. Not only in terms of academia being stovepiped in, you know, the epidemiology department, engineering, et cetera, no real world problem occurs in a vacuum. I mean, it's multidisciplinary. How do we not only massage or influence academia, but the way we look at doing business? In the United States government, we have an Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance. We have the sustainable development side, but there's a divide filled with, you know, a moat filled with crocodiles in between, bureaucratically speaking and financially speaking. How do we rejigger what we do to address these future problems?
Having been a diplomat, and I will tell you, OFDA is just dealing with acute kinds of events. There's not real long-term planning. And monies are decreasing, so those things that used to be done in USAID are no longer being done in USAID. So I don't know. I think the emphasis has got to come from, we just published an article in the Lancet. I wrote it on a Sunday in Hawaii, I live in Hawaii, and I sent it to the Lancet, and by the time I woke up the next morning, I got an email saying, it's been accepted without edits. Now, that's never happened to me before, okay? Never happened to me again. And they published it immediately online. But what it was calling for a global authority for crises. So taking the international health regulations and moving it so for the Hades and the other things, okay? And the trouble is that it's been countries, primarily the United States, that have kept OCHA, remember, when it was the Department of Humanitarian Affairs, and then the NGOs didn't want that. So it's there. It's under-resourced, underfunded. And so when a Haiti happens, the U.S. and everybody jumps on and say, see, you're not prepared. But they don't have resources, okay? And the U.S. sees this as business. When they go to disasters, whether tsunami or Haiti, you know, businesses make money. I mean, it's difficult to see. But we do need a global authority. And OCHA-like, you know, I'll be glad to send you the article, but Lancet thought it was important enough to just put it out there. We've had no responses from it. Okay? People are scared, I think, but we're not going to get there until we have some global authority in crisis with all the resources and begin to start doing the strategic plans and things like that. Otherwise, it will remain at the nation-state level, and I don't know. I really don't. Even with the international health regulations, even though we get better surveillance since we haven't had a pandemic in a while, some of the developing countries have stopped doing the surveillance. That's really benefited all the developing countries, but we still, you know, we can still do better surveillance than we did prior to that point. But it's always an uphill battle, but we do need a global authority in crisis. There's no getting away from it. No getting away from it. And we have to give some muscle to the UN. I mean, it's going to come from some kind of UN agency, whether it's an OCHA or an OCHA-like agency. But the fact that people don't have the guts to sort of bring it up, I don't know. I don't know how it's done, but that's my answer to it. I can't think of any other way around it.
Thank you.
Oh, yes, sure. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you. Going back to the previous question about professional opportunities and young people getting involved in disaster management, humanitarian assistance. Those of us of a certain age who got involved typically were professionals in some other area and had an experience, regardless of what the discipline was, had an experience with a disaster and became engaged.
Right.
This whole idea now, you've identified this as the decade of the community, and there's a lot of interest in community resilience and community empowerment. That's really the open, fertile field for young people to get involved. The idea of expecting that you go to a graduate school and you're going to be placed immediately in some wonderful experience around the world has never been the way to go about, or it's never been the actual way that most people have gotten involved. And the idea of getting involved in a community where there are opportunities, where experiences can be had, and where there's a need. Hopefully we don't use this community decade as just a way to defer federal responsibility to already challenged states and local communities.
Well, you know, I gave a talk on the decade of the community about 3 weeks ago to the National Academy of Sciences. And there were FEMA people there and others. And, you know, FEMA people talking, they said, you know, they used to be response, but they're now just giving out grants. But they're sort of toying with the fact that maybe we should have more of a response kind of category. But it really is left up to the communities themselves. We also say, and a lot of people call me, write me, I don't see most of them, emails, I say, look, learn how to do these things domestically first before you go out. Haiti, as you know, was an absolute debacle. The majority of people who showed up at Haiti were under the age of 30, and this was their first event. Between 1% and 45% of the patients who had amputations, they were not indicated. We had a guy who claimed he was a doctor when they were asking for doctors. Yeah, he was a doctor, he had a PhD in yoga, but he did amputations. We had EMTs from the Midwest who did amputations, okay? The movement, however, I don't want to talk more about that, that's bad enough, but there is a strong, strong movement of professionalizing humanitarian health workers. There's a movement for the logisticians and the security people too, things like that. But this would function both domestically and internationally, but it's competency-based. So you have, let's say, physicians and nurses who have those discipline skills, and there's a separate set of what we call core competencies that are related to working as a team, working in a humanitarian setting, which are totally different, okay? And trained in both of those becomes the new disciplines, right? And we have brought together all the 12 humanitarian academic affiliated training centers in humanitarian health in North America, 3 from Canada together, and forming a professional association. There's one it's part of the ELRA process, and so there's regional hubs, one in the UK, just got back from Germany, University of Bonn, and 21 other academic centers are doing this because the EU has told them, and given them the money, thank God, and said, what we want from you is to know that when there's a major natural disaster in any EU country, that they're going to be taken care of very well. And 2, if the EU sends foreign medical teams out, like to the Hades of the world, that they are excellent trained and great integrity, because their reputations have been wrong. There were 70 foreign medical teams. They were all over the place. They weren't communicating. It was a real debacle. We can't have that anymore, okay? And people will not be doing care unless they're trained to it. But we mix, actually, the teams. There are a number of different things I don't have time to talk to you about, but we would mix people who are senior experts along with the young ones, okay? So there are a mentoring process in that. But so it's competency-based training that decides the curriculum. The curriculum, they get a certification, not credentialing, so like ACLS or ATLS, and then it goes to a registry. And when this, with the registry, then we were asking the international organizations, the NGOs, to only employ and deploy those people who are actually part of the registry. All right? And so we're not really, global, we're no longer domestic and international, okay? It's global now. So we expect that thing no matter where. We've certainly had things messed up in Katrina, okay? The DMATs showed up and their triage protocols, trauma-related, their packs. What were they getting? They were getting patients from critical care units, but they kept doing the same trauma triage, So there's a lot that everybody can learn, all right? And a lot of this hopefully will come out at the community level. And so when even the people who are going to be deployed to those areas, they already know, because the information in Australia that's going to come from those communities is in a risk registry, okay, which anybody can look. So they can pull up the community and they know exactly what the risks are, what they need, et cetera. So it'll be much more efficient and whatever. But we're just in the beginning of that. And when we're making progress, we don't have any money. It's all being done by idiots like myself, free time. But we are going forward because we can't handle this stuff anymore. That's been seen not only domestically but internationally. Does that help in some way?
I think we better thank you. And
Okay.
tell Tony outside for
Okay, thank you so much. I appreciate it. All right.